The Bone Shredder has been in every single Borderlands game since the beginning, and has been a personal favorite of mine the entire time. While it was never the best option, it was still a strong weapon for most characters. In Borderlands 3, however, the Bone Shredder is a pistol for some reason. But does it still hold up? Can you beat Borderlands 3 with only the Bone Shredder? The rules for this run are as follows. We're playing on True Voltaire mode, Mayhem 11, Guardian rank is off, and the only weapon we're allowed to use is the Bone Shredder. For our gear, we've got a max DPS Bone Shredder in every element, each one with the barrier critical hit anointment, some random purples for our shield and grenade, one with action skill and corrosive damage, and the other with action skill and radiation damage. Then for our class mod, we went with a purple disruptor class mod, with flat off accuracy and reload speed. And while there was obviously better options for this challenge, I just enjoy suffering so much, so purple class mod it is. For the artifact, we chose a corrosive stone static charge. I chose this artifact specifically because it didn't affect the run at all, but still allowed us to have 3 passives, for which I chose reload speed, magazine size, and pistol damage. Not that any of that actually matters because the artifact we use changes pretty quickly in the run anyway. This is the build we're running. We have Mantis Cannon and Barrier for the action skills, Mantis Cannon to activate Zane's multiple kill skills through seeing red, and Barrier to activate the Barrier crit anoint on the Bone Shredders. However, I didn't want to make this challenge run too easy by just hiding behind the Barrier to become basically immune, so I disallowed holding the Barrier, and pretty much just threw it in a corner to have my anointment active. If I were to do this run again, which I'm definitely not going to, I would probably switch to Sentinel and then use the Sentinel Cryo Anoint on my Bone Shredders instead, since with the Barrier Anointment my damage relied heavily on hitting critical hits, which becomes a problem later on. This challenge run started off the same way that all challenge runs do, with us getting off Marcus's bus, picking a head and skin combo that's at least somewhat thematic with the gun we're using, and heading off to meet Lilith. By now I'm sure you're asking what the problem with the Bone Shredder is to make this run a challenge. Well, as you can see here, the damage on it is almost non-existent without a broken mechanic to carry it, and despite it doing no damage, it also consumes 3 ammo per shot, which means that we burn through ammo super quickly while doing very little damage. These first zealots have lower health than regular zealots, and by the time we cleared them out, we had already gone through over 80% of our ammo. And before we could even kill the first few enemies in the next section, we were completely out of ammo. The damage on this gun is so bad that killing things in Fight for Your Life was almost entirely out of the question, especially with Zane. But after 6 deaths, we managed to fight our way to Vaughn and get our first legendary of the playthrough, which of course was a God Roll Hellwalker. Holy I was kidding, but okay. Sure. Thankfully, there's 0 mandatory combat from this point until Mouthpiece, so we just ran straight over there to try our first real boss with the Bone Shredder. And honestly, it went way better than I expected. I mean, mind you, Mouthpiece does have less health than even some anointed enemies, but we were off to a strong start. At least until I died, with 0 ammo and nobody to punch. No! I can't open chests when I'm dead! I can't use melee either. Attempt 2 was much more of the same, only this time I just aimed better, meaning we wasted less bullets, and even after killing an Apocalypse for a second wind, was able to take down Mouthpiece with ammo to spare. Woo, we did it! Oh, we're almost out of ammo again. Though Mouthpiece must have seen the future, because he dropped me something that would end up being absolutely imperative for this challenge run.
Jesus Christ. That's Jason Bourne.
After bringing Tannis the Vault map, we ran into our very first anointed enemy, who was barely even tickled by the 400 or so bullets I shot into the back of his head. What the fuck? Yeah, anointed enemies become a very consistent problem for the rest of this challenge run, especially when I'm already being shot at before I can even respawn. However, after 7 deaths or so, I managed to actually take him down. Don't worry though, we didn't get a break for long, as immediately after, another anointed enemy spawned, this time an anointed Tink. Though being completely isolated made him an easy, albeit boring enemy to kill. So anyway, right after that, another 2 anointed enemies spawned, and as if getting hook-shotted by anointed zealots wasn't already bad enough, Lilith decided to be a complete troll and juke me out with her revive, accounting for yet another death. Lilith? What the hell? Why would you do that? She came to revive me just to leave. That was so rude. It was at this point that 2 things became incredibly clear to me. Firstly, this challenge run would not be possible without that bullet vamp we found earlier. And secondly, taking on anointed enemies with other badasses around was almost impossible. So I put on the bullet vamp artifact and took down the final badass zealot in the area, leaving just me and the 2 anointed enemies. And Lilith, I guess, but what is she gonna do? And believe it or not, it was much less awful to take out the anointed enemies when I wasn't getting spammed by rocket launcher blasts. Still awful, mind you, but less awful. After taking down the 3rd and 4th anointed enemies, we could finally get back to the easy stuff, running over the same enemy 20 times because ram damage isn't scaled properly. Thanks, Gearbox. And grabbing the astronav chip for Sanctuary, which thankfully requires no combat, before finally taking flight with only 23 deaths on the counter. Upon arriving at Promethea, I'm reminded that I am in fact playing Borderlands 3. Wow. Before killing the only 2 mandatory enemies at Watershed Base. I then contact Reese, spend way longer than I care to admit chasing down an Amber Lamps. Dude, you get back here! And get absolutely bodied by 3 Maliwan heavies at the weapons depot. Like, you would not believe how boring that shit is to, oh my god. Then we made our way to Gigamind, who I was honestly a little bit concerned about. I've had non-restricted, normal mode runs where this boss gives me a hard time with all his spinning and jumping around, so I figured he'd be a huge problem for this run as well. However, Gigamind was so surprisingly cooperative this time around, and all things considered, was kind of a pushover. It's almost like he just wasn't trying at all. I don't know if it was just because I was speed Zane, but I swear, man was moving in slow motion. There were even multiple times during the fight that he just stood still and let me unload my magazine into his back. Even more so when he was frozen. After we took out Gigamind, we then brought his brain to Reese and made our way to Athenas, where we were absolutely plowing through the Maliwan guys. At least for a little bit, before I got completely trolled by Screen Shake, then pulled a move straight out of Looney Tunes. Maya came in, and I'm stuck. I literally could not move. Can I move now? Nah. Oh, I can move. Let's go. Oh. In fact, I was so confident during this mission that I even let Maya 1v1 a Maliwan trooper, or at least try, before meeting up with everybody's favorite adolescent Borderlands character, getting the iridium we needed for Maya, and taking down Trant. The Trant fight v1 was honestly pretty fine. The majority of his attacks are telegraphed pretty far in advance and rather easy to dodge, but his dots can be absolutely devastating if you get one. The biggest problem here was having enough ammo for the fight, but thankfully his arena is full of ads to get ammo back from, and despite a couple of close calls, Trant went down relatively easy, allowing us to grab the Vault Key fragment and make our way to Skywell 27. Skywell was quite similar to Athenas. All of the mandatory combat here is Maliwan, which didn't really pose too much of a problem. However, I also didn't have another person there to revive me, which made my dumb plays way more punishing. Though all things considered, it was mostly just more Maliwan guys. The death spheres were certainly a lot harder to kill than I anticipated, but that's fine. It's not like there's a much stronger death sphere coming up in a few minutes or anything. Anyway, we then skipped more non-mandatory combat, destroyed the servers, shut down the firewall, and took out the last of the Maliwan guys before fighting Katagawa Ball. Katagawa Ball was the first actually challenging boss of this challenge run. Unlike Mouthpiece, Gigamind, or Trant, Katagawa Ball doesn't actually spawn any ads in his arena during the fight, meaning that I have nobody to get second wins off of if I die, and more importantly, nobody to get ammo back from using the cut purse. Combine this with the fact that Katagawa Ball moves around almost constantly and is airborne, and that makes for a pretty difficult time. Our first attempt was going pretty decently, at least until I ran out of ammo and got sloppy in my search for more. Bro, don't. For attempt 2, the fight started at full ammo, so I managed to whittle down Katagawa Ball's health a little bit more, but having learned absolutely nothing from the previous attempt, I got way too reckless trying to punch the giant flying sphere for ammo back, and obviously got destroyed. However, for attempt 3, I fully locked in, only firing the Bone Shredder when the barrier was out as to not waste any of our precious ammo, making sure to always have a fully loaded magazine to outheal any damage Katagawa Ball sent my way, and overall just played a lot more carefully, taking very few unnecessary risks. And after almost 10 minutes of tickling this boss on the final attempt, we finally took him down, grabbed the second Vault Key fragment, and had a quick celebration with Kitty Cat. What's that, Kitty? You think they should like and subscribe? I think so too, kitty. Atlas HQ is probably one of the easiest zones in the entire game. The only mandatory combat leading up to the courtyard is the 3 Nullhounds who, once I remembered to use the barrier for its anointment, were an absolute cakewalk to take down. If I'm being honest, I fully expected the courtyard section to actually be a little bit rough. But much to my pleasant surprise, the turrets in this area absolutely carried the fight. I don't know if Gearbox just messed up the scaling on Mayhem 11 or if it was intentional, but the turrets in this map are completely broken at endgame. Speaking of things that are broken at endgame, Katagawa Jr. If you've ever farmed for a Sandhawk in this game, you'll know just how absolutely broken this boss fight is. In most cases, you just have to shoot one of the generators as Katagawa splits up into his clones and he will instantly die. But in my case, all I had to do was punch him one single time and he just gave up right away. And remember, we're not allowed Guardian rank for this challenge run, so this wasn't Groundbreaker damage. And with that, we were done in Atlas HQ with absolutely 0 problems. Woo, car missions, so exciting. We then made it to Apollyon Station, where we once again were fighting COV enemies. And while normally this would pose a much bigger problem, this time it didn't for some reason. There were a lot of objects for us to hide behind, which made strategic positioning a lot easier. Plus I had Maya here again to back me up and revive me if necessary. Even this anointed Tink was pretty easy to take down, even if it did take about 1,000 bullets, and while this anointed Zealot could have been a problem for me, as they usually are, we didn't actually have to fight him. Yeah, Maya just said hell nah and blasted open the door, allowing us to skip this combat entirely. It makes me wonder if I really had to kill any of these enemies, or if I could have just skipped all of it by directing Maya to the door. Regardless, the rest of the map is now completely non-mandatory combat, so we can now run straight to the Rampager. I wouldn't really call the Rampager a hard boss. He's got a load of health, only having less than Tyreen and Grave Ward, but his attacks are slow and very easy to dodge, which means we were essentially just shooting it until it died here. About 15 minutes and several thousand bullets later, the Rampager was defeated. We looted the vault, Maya went on a very long all-inclusive cruise, and we started what would quite possibly end up being the worst part of this challenge run. The problem with Eden 6 is the fact that it's primarily COV enemies we're fighting there. And where there's COV enemies, there's anointed enemies. And if you've been paying any attention up until this point, you'll know that anointed enemies, especially in large numbers, can be a very big problem. I'm actually going to put an anointed enemy counter just above my death counter to count all the non-unique enemies that I had to kill, meaning that the named anointed enemies don't count. We then speak to Wainwright, who wants us to save his imprisoned husband, so we make our way over to the Anvil, where we are actually blessed by 0 anointed enemies in the first area. Don't worry, the game makes up for it immediately after, where after meeting up with Brick, we are immediately greeted by not just 1 or 2, but 3 anointed enemies at the same time. Thankfully, the Anvil is a relatively large map, which gave us lots of places to not only run, but also hide as we very slowly chipped away at each of these anointed enemies' health. Plus, we had Brick for revives, so these 3 weren't too bad all things considered. After that, I jumped into the Void, obviously, and fought another 3 anointed enemies before entering the prison. Once again, lots of open space and Brick made these 3 anointed enemies relatively easy to kill. The next area surprisingly only had 1 anointed militant, who once I took out his supporting badasses was relatively easy to kill. It's the next area, however, that I really want to talk about. This area was an absolute disaster. For whatever reason, this room was absolutely full of not only anointed enemies, but also badasses with rocket launchers, and enemies with physical shields, which make it much harder to get ammo back from them using the cut purse. Just look at how chaotic this area was. Half the time I couldn't even tell what I was shooting at, and if I stopped shooting for more than 3 seconds, my health bar would get absolutely deleted. Needless to say, I died many times in this area. But after about 10 straight minutes of struggling, I was able to lure this anointed maniac into the previous area, which made killing him a lot easier since it was now one-on-one. However, when I tried the same thing with his friend, I had spent so long doing this that the enemies in the previous area had respawned, making this no longer an option. After about 40 minutes in this area alone, I was finally able to take out the last 3 anointed enemies in this room. I was never really able to keep track of the amount of anointed enemies that spawned here, even in post, so we'll just call it 6 for the counter, because that sounds about right. The only reason my deaths didn't get into the hundreds here was because Brick was there to revive me, which was a huge saving grace. Needless to say, I needed another kitty break after this. After the kitty break was over, I barrel trolled myself, grabbed the ham, onions, and sauce for Tina's pizza, and made my way to the bridge, where I was immediately greeted by 2 more anointed enemies. Yeah, I died a lot here too. None of the usual strategies were actually working here. We couldn't brute force it because there was just way too much damage to heal through, and even when we did manage to get close to killing someone, their friends would just create a human shield around them. Staying back didn't work because the enemies were using aimbot or something, and even picking out the weakest ones first to thin out the herd didn't work because the anointed militant would just block everyone I shot. After 20 deaths or so, I decided I had to try something else here because obviously this wasn't working. What I ended up doing was luring out the anointed enemies again, making the fights 1-on-1 or at worst a 2-on-1 and much less impossible. After I took out the 2 anointeds, it was much easier to take out the last of the remaining badasses on the bridge and deal with the surprise 3rd anointed enemy of that area. Then we absolutely nailed the trick shot here and continued on to Warden. Compared to the rest of the map, Warden was an absolute breeze. Warden will spawn 1 level under the player, which means that he's got about as much health as Katagawa Ball, but without any of the gimmicks that make that fight hard. And being Speed Zane made his rocket attacks really easy to dodge. Plus, Warden also spawns a bunch of really weak ads in his arena during the fight, which made our 1 close call a non-issue, even as Zane using a Bone Shredder. The only concern I had for the Warden fight was him leveling up and healing. If you didn't know, once Warden's health gets past this line here, he starts behaving like a regular Raging Goliath, attacking whatever is closest, and if he manages to kill one of his allies, he will heal back up to full health and level up to a maximum of level 75, where not only would he have way more health, but he'd also resist a little bit of our already abysmal damage. Thankfully, on higher Mayhem levels, it's very hard for enemies to actually kill their own allies, so that didn't happen, and after a short while, we managed to kill Warden and free Hammerlock. Jacob's Estate is another area with very little mandatory combat, and you know what that means? We gunned it straight for the objective. There were unfortunately a few minor casualties thanks to a cryo rocket launcher by the lift next to the manor, which meant that I actually had to ride the lift and not just skip it. Then I survived the ambush just long enough for the door to open and ran straight to Billy. Billy is yet another boss who's really just a big wall of health with easy to dodge attacks, and he has an ammo vendor accessible from his arena, so this fight was pretty simple. It's pretty telling that the only time I died during this fight, it was to one of Billy's ads. A few rather boring minutes and many bullets later, I took down Billy, grabbed Montgomery Jacobs' record, met with Clay to take back Reliance, and ate a face full of rockets. Aside from the initial explosion to the face and obligatory anointed enemy, Reliance was pretty painless, and we had multiple people ready to revive us if need be. Now, it did get a little scary near the end when Long Arm Smasher spawned in with 2 anointed maniacs. However, luckily for us, Long Arm is the only required kill in this wave of enemies, meaning we didn't even have to fight those anointed enemies, and after a quick save quit, we're able to turn the power back on to Reliance. Outside Fort Sunshine, we had to take out another 2 anointed enemies, who I guess just weren't satisfied with being ignored in Reliance. And then we hopped on the rail to Fort Sunshine, where I saw something that after 3,000 hours of playtime, I have never seen. Bye. I have done this at max level so many times. I don't think I've ever once seen a badass there. Yo, wait, don't do this to me, bro. Don't do it. Don't, bro. Oh my God, stop it. Stop it. Stop. No. Oh, why? Oh, man. Then we took out Turnkey Tim, bodied some turrets, tickled another anointed enemy to death, and freed Dalton. Speaking of freeing people, we then made our way to Voracious Canopy, where we freed everybody's favorite pink teddy bear voiced by Ice-T, skipped all non-mandatory combat, dismantled some Malawan robots, and silenced the horny jabbers before silencing the horny jabbers. Oh, and don't mind my death counter here. My cat walked across my keyboard and reset my deaths to 0, but it got fixed eventually. Genevieve was another boss who I was worried about. She moves around a lot and has a lot of visual clutter that would make it very hard to aim at her. But she just kinda got bodied. Yeah, once I started firing at the correct mech, Genevieve just got completely destroyed. I think Brain Freeze was actually slowing her movements down a bit, which made it way easier than it should have been to take her down and grab the first Volt Key fragment. Collecting Agent D's rogue ID was a little rough. This map was full of badasses with elemental rocket launchers, which when shot near water create elemental puddles that deal obscene amounts of damage over time, especially when you aren't expecting it. However, after a little while, I guess the enemies figured I wasn't actually an issue and started focusing on D, which made it simple enough to tickle the remaining enemies to death and collect Agent D's ID. Quietfoot's ID was nice and easy. None of the Mudknack gang can spawn as anointed enemies, thankfully, so the hardest enemy I fought here was this badass Goliath before grabbing the ID. Securing the docks was another pretty straightforward task. Most of these enemies are scripted to either be Boom Saints or basic Goliaths, which again means no anointed enemies. However, halfway through, I guess the game got sick of all the progress I was making and decided to just destroy my internet. After my internet came back, I broke up a 4-way Goliath free-for-all and killed a badass zealot before getting Domino's ID from his office and summoning the Hollow Jabber. This is also where we got our 100th death of the playthrough. I thought the Hollow Jabber could revive me, so I was playing very aggressively. As it would turn out, however, it can't revive you, which will be good to know for future runs, I suppose. Archimedes was an absolute pushover. At this point in the run, fighting anointed enemies one at a time isn't even a big deal anymore, so I didn't even break a sweat here. On to Black Barrel Cellars, where I skipped all of the non-mandatory combat we could until we got to this area. There are 2 mandatory waves of combat in this area, and fighting enemies here is always a bad time. There's environmental damage everywhere, it's COV, so lots of explosions and anointed enemies, and it's dark as hell. Luckily enough, after this anointed maniac barrel trolled me, he decided to follow me to the new U station, isolating himself and becoming a very easy kill. And while I wish I could say the same for the next anointed enemy, he just kind of planted himself at the doorway and threw purple balls at me nonstop, leading to quite a few more deaths, though we eventually managed to take him down and grab the Vault Key. While Aurelia herself isn't too difficult of a boss fight, she loves to spawn a bunch of ads around the arena and create a crap load of visual pollution, giving those ads lots of places to hide. Our first attempt failed after I hyper-focused on getting ammo and completely ignored the fact that I was being shot at. But our second attempt, I tried to prioritize clearing out any ads that she spawned, which made Aurelia just another wall of health I had to slowly chew through. I then absolutely blazed through the statue riddles right after, and headed towards Grave Ward. If there's one boss who's a figurehead for just being a ginormous wall of health, it's Grave Ward. His attacks are quite possibly the easiest in the game to dodge, his crit spots are massive, he spawns lots of ads to get ammo back from, but he has a lot of health. Grave Ward actually has the most health of any of the base game bosses, which makes it even funnier that this was actually one of the easiest boss kills of the entire challenge run. It was pretty much just 7 straight minutes of shooting the yellow parts of Grave Ward until he eventually falls over and dies. While we wait for me to do that, did you know that these runs are actually streamed live on both Twitch and YouTube? That's right, I stream all sorts of Borderlands Challenge and Allegiance runs every Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday from 6 PM EST. So if you want to take part in the decisions for these runs, or just hang out with like-minded people and talk about Borderlands, be sure to follow me on Twitch using the link in the description so you're notified whenever I go live. Oh look, Grave Ward's dead. Cool. We then made our way to the Splinterlands, where I tried to enter Carnivora, got told no. Tried to skip some optional combat, got told no. Tried skipping the combat again, got told no again, tried one more time, but then got told no again. So you know what that means, we had to deal with another anointed enemy, who thankfully didn't show up until the last minute, so it was just me, him, and some random Goliath who couldn't even decide whose team he was on. Then we got to deal with another anointed militant who again showed up very late to the party, so he was a pretty easy kill too. Big Donnie, to nobody's surprise, is weak. I mean, he's literally just a badass tank with a badass tank turret. But of course, when he died, he dropped a legendary inside of said turret, so rather than ignoring it and just continuing on with the mission, I spent another minute and a half spraying the Big D with bullets until it exploded, which was totally worth the Ice Spiker safeguard with very mid passives. Yay, we got into Carnivora. I'm just so happy to be here that the first thing I'm gonna do is immediately skip all of this entire area and not fight anyone. Now, I know that this is a glitch method of dealing with Carnivora, but none of the combat here is actually required anyway, so it was either this or running straight through with no combat. Plus, it's a freaking YouTube video, get over it. The fun thing about Carnivora, the vehicle not the map, is that its breakable points weren't scaled properly for Mayhem mode, so it was incredibly easy, even with the Bone Shredder, to cut it off and take it down. Remember this because it's gonna come back to bite me soon. The Guts of Carnivora has 0 mandatory combat, so I just made a beeline straight for Agonizer 9000. You remember 5 seconds ago when I said Carnivora's breaking points didn't get scaled properly at endgame? Well, you know what else doesn't get scaled properly at endgame? Agonizer 9000's critical hit spots. That's right, this boss's crit spots can only take about 3 shots from my pistol before they blow up and disappear from the fight entirely. And as we all know from the intro, critical hits are my main source of damage, so this fight was an absolute slog. After all of his crit spots were destroyed, my damage tanked significantly. I mean seriously, this is at 10 times speed, and watch how slowly his health is going down. Despite this, on attempt 1 I actually got way closer than I expected. I was able to punch Agonizer's arm to get ammo back, which was helpful, but then there was also 2 adds with E-Tech weapons whose damage over time effect managed to outdamage my lifesteal, and we're speed zane, so getting second wins isn't happening. Ending attempt 1 after 12 minutes. Attempt 2, I'm not even entirely sure what killed me. I think jumping into his spike paddle was dealing damage to me, which in retrospect should have been pretty obvious. And one of his floor traps managed to go off onto me while I was running, which also put a fire dot on me. However, this time we only lost about 5 minutes of progress, so it hurt far less than last time. Before starting attempt 3, I bought a grenade from the ammo vendor outside of the arena with an action skill and 50% cryo anoint to replace my radiation anoint, as cryo is much more effective against armor than radiation is. This didn't really seem to have too much of an impact on our overall damage, which was still absolutely abysmal. However, after a few close calls in this arena caused primarily by my inability to jump over slow-moving objects, I started prioritizing any bandits that had guns, which made this fight a lot less one-sided. And after a full 20 minutes of running around in a circle shooting anything that moves, we killed Agonizer 9000 and saved Tannis. Then we made our way to Roland's Rest, where, big surprise, they were under attack and we needed to save them, taking down another 3 anointed enemies before making our way to Conrad's Hold. The only mandatory combat of this entire map is the Varkids at the very end, so needless to say, I just ran past all the bandits straight to Tannis' lab. Once we cleared out the Varkids, we could get the Iridian Amplifier, and after a very exciting car mission, deliver it to Roland's Rest, talk to Lilith, and prepare for the definitely final assault on the Calypsos. Ooh. Come on, bro! So the only mandatory combat in the Cathedral of the Twin Gods is this first area here and the anointed enemies at the end. The rest can all be skipped. However, that doesn't mean we had a good time here. Pretty standard stuff, it's a COV area, so anointed enemies were expected. However, this is also where we got our first anointed goon of the run. Anointed goons can spawn a bunch of tinks onto the battlefield, which made this fight not only way more difficult, but also much louder as well. Clearly trying to prioritize taking out the goon wasn't gonna work, but after I respawned, this anointed maniac just kind of delivered himself to me, which made taking him out very easy. Once he was dead, taking out this anointed militant was just a matter of patience, which means I could finally deal with this goon one-on-one. Well, 6-on-1, but it's the same thing here. By far, the hardest part of this fight was not going completely insane from the screaming tinks. I mean, just listen to the screams. I still hear them when I sleep at night. Alright, the goon's dead. That means we can just do the skip straight to Rachel. Unlike the last anointed goon, Rachel starts off as a 1v1 essentially, so she was far less of an issue. Then it's just a matter of taking out Nathan and Luke, who again were 1v1s, so they posed very little issues. Something that I'm just now realizing while editing this is that Nathan and Luke aren't tied to an objective at all, which means that they too are completely optional combat. The only thing you need to do after Rachel dies is turn the 4 valves and shoot the pipes, then you can just run straight through to the Great Vault. Good to know. Keeping up with the theme of this challenge run, the boss right after all the stressful mobbing was an absolute cakewalk. Just like Grave Ward and the Rampager, Troy's attacks are very clearly telegraphed and super easy to dodge. Like many things, I think Gearbox might have overcorrected a bit when it came to bosses in Borderlands 3. I mean, don't get me wrong, Borderlands 2 and the pre-sequel had some pretty unforgiving bosses, but the boss fights in 3 don't even feel scary. Most of them have super easy to dodge attacks and telegraph those attacks so far in advance. Then almost every single boss in the game has enemies to get second wins off of that are deliberately crippled compared to their normal counterpart. And then there's the fights where you literally have an NPC to revive you if you get downed. It says a lot that the hardest part of most of these boss fights were the mobs in the arena with the boss rather than the boss themselves. I don't know, just something to think about with Borderlands 4 coming over the horizon. Anyway, where was I? Right, yeah, he got tickled to death with very little issues. Necrotafeo is relatively a really big planet where seemingly nothing actually happens, so we're just gonna rapid fire through this stuff. We got to Necrotafeo, bodied some necrobugs, met the first Vault Hunter Danny DeVito, took out some elite mechs, canceled Maliwan's Hydra contract, wasted Trant V2, killed the Maliwan guys, solved the hardest puzzle in any Borderlands game, grabbed the Vault Key, placed the Vault Key, and made our way to the Pyre of the Stars. Pyre of the Stars actually started off pretty fine. Guardians aren't too big of a deal, but this map is also full of COV enemies who are semi-mandatory. I thought for sure the game was going to require me to kill these two anointed Goliaths and anointed Milton, but the machine must have been taking lessons from Handsome Jack because the door just opened. How nice. After placing the Eden 6 Vault Key, it was pure combat, where I killed 1, 2, 3, 4 more anointed enemies before placing the final Vault Key and taking out the last 2 anointed enemies for a total anointed count of
37
anointed enemies who were required kills. A bit too much in my opinion, but you do you, Gearbox. With that said, it's time for the final boss fight. Tyreen the Tentacle Destroyer. Tyreen has a lot of health, the second highest of all base game enemies, and she also has a very small and wavy crit spot, which means that while not necessarily being difficult, this fight is probably gonna take a while. It took so long, in fact, that I got to the point where I was using the super unknown mechanic where you can actually punch Tyreen's iridium projectiles back at her, which was a neat way to get some ammo back at the very least, plus it kept my brain engaged, which meant less mistakes. About halfway through though, I remembered something that sped this fight up massively. The Destroyer's eyeball on Tyreen's back, you know, the one that breaks Tyreen out of her immunity phase, counts as a critical hit spot. But Tyreen is already easy to crit after breaking her out of her immunity phase, so how would that help? You see, even when Tyreen isn't knelt over, when the eyeball is supposed to be covered and closed off, you can still shoot it for critical hits. And while staying behind Tyreen in combat isn't the easiest, it's much easier than aiming at her phallic crit spot as it waves around the map occasionally. So for the rest of the fight, I made sure to stay behind Tyreen and shoot as many bullets as possible into the Destroyer's eyeball. And after about 10 minutes, and she is dead. Woo! Let's go! Oh my god. Proving once and for all that you can beat Borderlands 3 with only the Bone Shredder. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a fantastic day. Oh, and sorry for the lack of videos lately. This video took way longer to make than I expected it to.